And welcome into the Roundtable. And looking into 2024, what is the most optimal mode of transportation? Are we talking about rail? Are we talking about trucking? Are we talking about something else perhaps? Right now, let's just concentrate on those two and see where things may be headed in the new year. Joining us is Mike Bowden-Distler, head of Intermodal Solutions, as well as Thomas Watson, our enterprise trucking expert, as well, joining us here in Chattanooga. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us here and talking about what may be the optimal mode of transportation. Are we going to see any shifts in 2024? Mike, let me put the question to you. Right now, why is rail, in your opinion, perhaps, going to be optimal in the new year?
So for shippers, I think now is a good time to take a fresh look at intermodal. Maybe some shippers that have not used intermodal in the past or may have had a bad experience with intermodal service. You know, you do have to have freight that moves in lanes that is compatible with rail intermodal. But the rail service has really gotten a lot better. And I think that's the main thing. I mean, during the pandemic, we heard from shippers that said, you know, the service was so awful, they would have to go into rail terminals and pull out their containers to truck them on the highway. You know, we're hearing kind of the opposite right now. I mean, just really lots of compliments on service, particularly CSX. So I think that's number one. You do get that intermodal, savings of 10 to 15%. That's important too. But and the carbon, savings that a lot of shippers really care about. But I really think, service first and foremost is the biggest reason to take a fresh look at intermodal.
Thomas, question over to you. Why do you think trucking is going to be perhaps more optimal in the new year?
It really just depends on cost and time. I mean, if you're doing intermodal with a large lane, like Mike said, when intermodal has the lanes from large metros and time is not a factor, then it's really sometimes hard for truckload to compete. Now, with the rates being so low, truckload remains a very big savings option. So, anecdotally, folks who had a higher percentage in intermodal are still, we have lingering truckload carriers getting more of the action just because the prices are so low. So, I think that trucking and truckload, full truckload always has a place in a shipper's budget. It always has a place in terms of their scheme. It's just that for, the past, because of the rail service issues, truckload had gained out a little bit more than it historically has. So one of the big challenges for trucking will be, can they hold on to it? We hear about that, and even private fleets gaining ground. So trucking does have some headwinds ahead as we move into 24.
Mike, as you look at it, there's some obviously changes going on within the rail universe, if you will. Obviously, reciprocal switching, not completely online yet, but looks like that's certainly in the future here in a little bit. You also had kind of a little bit of a change, perhaps paradigm in terms of more cargo moving north-south. You obviously had CPKC having their merger, which puts cargo on one train from Canada all the way down to Mexico. How does that perhaps change rail's argument, if it does?
So the CPKC merger is really set off an opportunity, I think, for rail intermodal, because that merger has extended the reach of the combined railway networks. So it does, potentially open up a lot of new corridors on one railroad from, let's say, Chicago to Dallas, Mexico to Detroit, all of those things. And so you've seen other railroads partner up as what seems like a competitive response, where you've had Union Pacific and Canadian National, team up along with Ferromex, and a lot of them to move freight more heavily in more of a collaborative method, through Eagle Pass, Texas. So I think it has spurred, more sort of collaboration when you look at that merger. I think, the reciprocal switching thing, we'll see what ends up happening there. I mean, it really does pertain more to almost it really pertains more to the carload business rather than intermodal. Where it could impact intermodal is if that creates congestion on the railroad network. That could potentially impact intermodal service. I think we're a long way from those type of things happening.
Thomas, I remember I think it was a couple of rail conventions ago, there was a very strong intention for rail to try and pick up some of the market share that it had lost to trucking. What does trucking have to do to keep that market share as they've had it in these recent years?
To keep the market share, they'd have to be really cheap. But the problem is the cost is going to drive more of them out of the market. So I mean, this is a pendulum. Trucking cyclical. We will see this movement because of trucking and cost. But at the same time, like when you read reports and you get anecdotal things, some shippers had purposely been neglecting their portfolio for rail. So it's almost a return to normalcy. I mean, being the trucking expert, I'd love to see more volumes in trucking, but especially for those shipments when we have that lingering inventory, a little bit of confusion over consumer demand sometimes, it's still a situation where for those shipments, rail remains attractive. So, I mean, for trucking at the end of the day, if these were lanes that you traditionally ran and they're part of your RFP and you're the incumbent and you've had them for more than like 5 years, you should be fine. Now, if you get a new RFP and you see like a Los Angeles to Chicago and it looks a little bit different than what you're used to, maybe that used to be an intermodal lane. Who knows? Stuff like that. At the end of the day, I hate to go back to the relationship thing, but communicate, find out. You're going to know your customers. If they're talking about how during the next RFP that we're going to be losing some lanes because management wants to get more intermodal exposure, they're finally getting allotments or something, then that's something you're going to have to work around, and you're going to have a diversified customer mix. But yeah, I think that's something that we are looking at an eventuality, and then go maybe fast forward 4 or 5 years from now, we may see the pendulum swing again. It's just right now costs, and so I think with better rail service, it's going to be hard for trucking to continuously do it because it's almost like you're running a marathon. You're coming up near the end, you're out of gas, while the rail are finally starting to pick up some steam. There's my train joke.
So, Mike, let's dovetail off of that in terms of, again, rail looking to get more market share. Is this more or less a cyclical thing where you see maybe just inertia simply bringing more volumes back to rail, or is there something perhaps even more that railroads can do to increase volumes and put more on the intermodal?
Well, I think it's all about service is a thing. I mean, I think if you can provide a truck-like service, they're going to gain, some degree of market share, maybe recover some market share that was lost the past few years. Liked what JB Hunt had to say at F3. I mean, they're talking about basically taking 1 day transit time off of a typical intermodal move. And you think of an intermodal move as being truckload plus a day. So taking a day off of it is the equivalent of truckload. And they're talking about maybe moving that the containers on the highway if there's congestion or a flood or some disruption that would impair service. So I think service is a really important thing that both the railroads and their intermodal partners, those companies that own the containers or get the containers from someplace, provide. And then potentially some of these companies could open up more corridors to make those more viable options. Like at F3, JB Hunt was talking about having more volume in and out of Salt Lake City, in and out of Phoenix, in and out of Denver. So those are locations where really intermodal is kind of punched below its weight class because it's not the huge market like on LA to Chicago or LA to Dallas, but it makes a lot of sense when you think about how deeply backhaul those markets are on the highway. And those are fast growing consumption centers. So it does make sense, I think, to open up some of these other lanes.
Thomas, you brought it up earlier. Let's talk about it in terms of the attrition. Obviously, there's too much capacity in truckload at this point. That's going to deteriorate over time in natural ways. You would think. Will that become a problem in terms of how trucking can keep up with rail? In terms of they're just going to be losing volumes, and this is going to be a problem no matter what? Or is there anything they can do about it?
Well, just feel like a victim of your own success. Once enough capacity leaves the market, what typically happens are two things. Prices go up, rejection rates go higher, and service levels will go down. And, alluding to service right now, this is the perfect time for a shipper because you can really bully carriers on service levels and make sure they take all their allotments. But, at the same time, this won't last. And so what trucking does hope to see is a little more normalization in terms of supply and demand. Right now, the situation is still heavily skewed for shippers. So brokers and even truckload carriers are going to be in a disadvantage. But yeah, I think this will be a challenge because as we do see the market turn even into the second half of 24, one of the challenges will be is that in spite of the fact that truckload carriers will get higher costs, they're going to really start feeling the the pressure to try and maintain those service levels. And there is a concern that something like an intermodal, if you get an exasperated shipper and there's still space, that they'll go and try other modes if they feel like their carrier network is not able to do it. If you're having too many rejections, waterfall goes on at the spot, you're getting, way too much prices. I know we haven't seen that in a long time, but, that is the potential to happen. And, if I'm an intermodal executive, that's probably what you're banking on. Look at what Hunt and Schneider, all the large publicly traded truckload carriers are still using intermodal as a growth play. They're trying to hedge against the cyclical cycle, right? Because if you're pure play trucking, you'll make more revenue, but you may also have some more rough, choppy waters for your customers.
Certainly an interesting conversation to have as we get into 2024. You have service, you have cost, and you have the future. Which way are you going to go? Mike and Thomas, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, we'll take a short break here. We'll come back and wrap up this edition of FreightWaves Now after this.